G'day there, trendsetters. Welcome to Parsha and Psychology. This week's Parsha, we're talking about Pinchas. My apologies for this late upload. I was recovering from a bit of a back injury, but a big shout out to my osteo, Boaz from Reach Health. He fixed me right up, so if you ever need an osteo in Melbourne, check out Reach Health. Can't recommend them enough, they're great. So they fixed me up. And that was a bit of a result of just a lingering running injury. This is what I run in, Teva sandals. So this is all going to come together. You'll understand in a second why I'm talking about Teva sandals and running and everything. Everything ties together, or I try to tie everything together in this. And this week's topic, we're going to talk about Parshas Pinchas. We're in Bamidbar, Numbers. We're going to talk about violence and the subject of violence, how it affects our psychology, our inner world, how it's a reflection of our inner world and our evolutionary psychology and biology. And most importantly, a Torah attitude and Jewish attitude, albeit not the definitive one, but one that I'm going to bring and give over from a number of sources. And what is the Torah perspective on the use of violence? So the verse we're looking at here is Bamidbar, Numbers 25, 17 to 18. And this is the verse that we're going to focus on. And here, God commands the nation of Israel, Saror et ha-Midyanim, literally go out and oppress and wreak havoc with the Midianites. Why? As the verse continues in verse 18, Ki tzorim hem lachem, because they terrorized and oppressed you. So we've got, as it were, a commandment directly from God to go and wage war. And according to all the Mefarshim and the explanations, this war was no holds barred. This was all out, total war that was reached here. And you can go read the verses before that and afterwards, what happened and what led to that. We don't need to go into that detail here. What we're really talking about here, though, is the Torah's attitude to violence. So here we can have basically a biblically mandated war. And there are times, obviously, where history has, in modern history, given rise to what would amount to a biblically mandated war, what's called a milchemet mitzvah, a war of obligation. And a prime example of that would be the 1948, 1967, 1973, all these wars, etc., even all the other wars, operations in Gaza, which are for self-defense purposes, to prevent and create defense and peace outcomes when, unfortunately, war is wreaked havoc on your own people and your own nation. So war has its place. This is what needs to be understood. Violence has its place in Judaism. If you come and think that Judaism tells us to turn the other cheek, you're reading the wrong Bible. That is not in Judaism. So I'm going to go through a few sources here. We need to go look at Tehillim 144, verse 1. So King David, a man of peace, a man who played the harp, but he was also a warrior. And when he met Goliath, he didn't sit down for coffee and cake to discuss his differences. He ultimately slew him. But here's King David, Psalms, this is Tehillim 144, we read these a lot. So chapter 144, first verse here in the big book of Psalms, let David, for David, Baruch Hashem, praiseworthy is God, Tsuri, my rock, Hamelamed Yadai, he teaches my hands, lakrav, for combat, Etzvoatai, my fingers, lamilchama, for war. And I remember this verse, a friend came up to me, he was a KM instructor, and he wanted to get that emblazoned on a t-shirt, KM being Krav Maga. We'll come back to Krav Maga. So another example, biblical example, Moses, greatest prophet in the history of Jewish people, a lover of animals, a lover of peace, a lover of people. What happened when he came across an Egyptian slave master who was beating two Jewish slaves? Vayachet HaMitzri, he smote him, he beat him, he didn't sit down for dialogue. He saw that there was a case for self-defense that necessitated lethal violence, and he unleashed said lethal violence. That's Moses. Kohelet, this is Ecclesiastes. These verses are so timeless that they were transformed into this timeless song called Turn, Turn, Turn by the Birds. Birds with a Y, check it out on Spotify. And Kohelet was actually my late grandfather, Yehuda ben Eliezer's favorite book of the Bible to sit down and read. So we're going to Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 3, where it says, and these are very important verses. I want you to think about these. There's a time to kill and a time to heal. A time to wreck and a time to build. And notice that kind of paradox, if you will, that kind of yin and yang, that kind of complete, seemingly polar opposite which you might come and say parallels a kind of spiritual opposite of chesed, loving kindness, and gvura, severity. So we're going to go a bit into kind of Kabbalah, where these are I don't know if I've drawn that big enough, but you've kind of got on the right side these emotional attributes which are linked to God's, as it were, manifestations or flows of energy that kind of vivify and give life to the world. And they're also running through us in a kind of spiritual DNA way, if you will, in our makeup. So we've got a chesed side, we've got a capacity for loving kindness, and we've also got a capacity for gvura on the left side, the left arm, capacity for discipline, sternness, strictness, and harshness. And therein lies that kind of yin and yang, that balance. And in this verse, there's a time to be kind. There's a time to heal and build. But there's also a time for the opposite. There's a time to kill and there's a time to wreck. And it's very difficult to know when and what is the right thing to do and in what circumstances. And this is really the real test of being a human being. And one of the daunting tasks that's put upon us, especially people who've been through the military. So tying this all together, and one of the things with the running was I've been thinking about this a lot in general, but I also saw a recent video by a guy named Chad Wright. Now, Chad Wright is an ultra runner, and he's a former Navy SEAL. And he also happens to run, or he was experimenting in running with these Teva sandals, Israeli-made sandals. Of course, I'm nowhere near the caliber of this individual, and he's an amazingly inspirational person. He also happens to be a very staunch believer, very staunch Christian, and I think there's a lot of things we agree on. Obviously, I don't believe Jesus is the Messiah and the Lord and Savior. That's not my thing. I'm a Jew. I'm a Red Sea pedestrian. But I wish him well, and I wish him very great strength in following the Noahide laws and through that kind of divine service. So he actually made a video exploring a bit of biblical attitudes to violence. I wanted to bring in a Jewish perspective. Another source I want to bring to you guys, and again, I like to bring a bit of Chabad Lubavitch sources, of course. This is Hayom Yom, little tidbits of inspiration, probably pre-Instagram, little inspirational pieces compiled by the Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, a lot of teachings from the Rayats and all the previous Rebbes. And there's a great one, I couldn't find the exact date, but I recall it vividly, and that is that there the Rebbe refers to the Rebbe Rayats, the previous Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzhak Schneerson, and he says the Rebbe Rayats, he could ride a horse, he could drive a car, and he could shoot a gun. And in this capacity, he was an Ish Shalem, a complete person. So the capacity of violence, the capacity to know the art of violence, to know how to use weapons of violence, is actually part of being a complete human being, based on that teaching. And I think based on Kohelet's teaching, and understanding that we've got these seemingly paradoxical polar opposite sides within us. And I think it's a very important thing to be a complete person, and to be in general, and a complete Jew in particular, to have not only the skills to be kind and gentle and to heal, first aid course, vital, but also the capacity to defend yourself with violence if necessary. And one need not go into the recent news, the stabbing in Boston, shootings in synagogues in America, increase of anti-Semitism, nor our terrible history in the 20th century, to know that violence, albeit tragic, is sometimes tragically necessary. And that's the big thing I want to get across, is that it's dangerous for Jews to not be able to be dangerous. So I'm very fortunate that I had the privilege to serve in the IDF, which makes me somewhat dangerous a bit, That's my Sikat Lochem badge of being in combat. It's my old dog tags. And also done a bit of Krav Maga. Now, I definitely need to do some refreshers of Krav Maga to make sure my sword is sharpened. And of course, it's the Jewish vision from Isaiah chapter 2 verse 4 that is emblazoned on the side of the United Nations for world peace, that one day we will beat our swords into plowshares. But until that day comes, if an enemy is coming to attack me and my family with a sword, I don't want a plowshare. I want to be able to defend myself. So it's very important to understand that whilst violence is tragic, it has its place and it's sometimes tragically necessary. Now, a big warning from modern history is the Moriori. Little reference down here in New Zealand. Big shout out to my mate Zach, who shared me this little historical tidbit. The Moriori, that's New Zealand I drew there. You probably can't see it, and my artistry is not that great. So New Zealand is near Australia. It's in the Southeast Pacific, if you will. And island people, there was a set of people called the Moriori, Polynesian descent, who went and settled a few islands. I think they were Chatham Islands. They were off the coast of New Zealand. And over hundreds of years, they lived there and created a society. But they were a very peaceful society. And they left their warrior past and the art of war behind. They buried it. They didn't embrace at all violence. And they, through societal culture, etc., they kind of weaned it out. What happened to them? What happened was the musket wars occurred, where some rival Maori tribes came to them, conquered their territory, killed or enslaved 95% of their population. Basically, overwhelmingly, completely decimated them through force, because they had forgotten what happens, and they'd forgotten the necessity of violence. And unfortunately, their isolation did not protect them. Now let's go to a bit of Ev Psych, because we've got to understand also, as it were, what I believe is an inner paradox within our evolutionary biology, with what makes violence so difficult. On the one hand, we've evolved as a species to be insanely cooperative. The fact that you and I right now, I'm recording this on an iPhone, you're probably watching this on a computer or some smartphone, I'm writing this with a texter on some paper. All of this is the creation of immense cooperation from different people across the world, different expertise, everybody from the logger who cut the wood to the guy in the paper mill who printed it, to the person who shipped this, packed this, sold this to me in Officeworks. There's so much cooperation going on. The person who made the plastic, all the design that went into this one, it's insane to even think about it. That is all cooperation from people who are really wired for incredible feats when we all put our heads together. What makes that possible? Part of that, what makes that possible, is our ability to communicate. Indeed, that is why the Kabbalah calls mankind medaber. That's the thing it focuses on, literally the one who speaks, the person who can communicate. And one of the things that makes our communication really, really effective is our ability to kind of detect through mirror neurons body language and behavior and emotions, and is this person willing to cooperate? Is he safe? Is she going to do a good deal with me? Basically, to collaborate and cooperate, one needs a really good feeling and empathy and connection with one another. And that's what makes us effective, and that's indeed why we've conquered the globe and gone to the moon, etc., etc. Through cooperation, which is all from an incredible capacity to empathize with another person, with another human being, to see them as their own individual sentient being and going, they're acting in their best interests, I'm acting in my best interests, let's kind of collaborate and make something great, whether it's the iPhone or whatever. Or these Sfarim printed beautiful things, enrich our lives. So this is all from our chesed, our capacity to cooperate, our capacity for mercy, to empathize and mirror neuron and think about what's going on in another person's head. Now that, you can imagine, does not bode well if you want to unleash harm on another person. You need to temporarily suspend that piece of software that's running in your conscious and subconscious mind of empathy, of mercy, of rachamim, of chesed, really. The right side. That needs to go out the window. That needs to be exiled, if you will, to use IFS terminology. And then we need to embrace another part of our evolutionary biology, which is our capacity for extreme violence, for lethal violence. Now that also has evolved over time. That has been sexually selected. Now, what that means is that if you're, especially in the male, because that is why you see it again and again. Now, what am I basing this on? I'm basing this on a lot of the teachings of David and Buss, Evolutionary Psychology. This is the Evolutionary Psychology textbook here that they give out, I think, in the University of Texas or something. That's Beat Eugene's podcast recommended that. So I'm getting stuck into that. I've read some other of his books, Evolution of Desire, etc., etc. On average, and this is, of course, law of averages, women, on average, will select a male mate, a male pair bond, that's typically larger than them, taller than them. There's typically a ratio on average. So on average, you're going to look at the average couple. The average couple, the male is, all things equal, going to be slightly taller and broader than the female. Now, of course, there's exceptions to every rule, and there's exceptions that make the rule, but just saying that. Now, why would a female choose a male, on average, who's going to be bigger? Because that male will then offer protective benefits to protect from intruders, to secure resources, and protect from rivals and dangerous other tribes like the Moriori. Tragically learn. What happens when dangerous tribes come and invade your territory? They'll kill and enslave you, take you away. So over time, males have been selected for people who had the characteristics of dominance and the characteristics of strength and the characteristics of prowess at combat. One of those things is, all things equal, that a male physique, which resembles an inverse triangle, right? Meaning broad shoulders, narrow waist, that is seen as something that's desiring because that shows strength. And that's why the shoulder pads in suit jackets, why I wear my suit jacket, because that accentuates that kind of ratio, if you will. So these are things that, whether you like it or not, are in our biology, in our genes. So it is what it is. And so there's been a lot of desire for this attribute on the one hand, in men. And that is why athletes are loved and lauded, and why do boys strive to be athletes, and why do we strive to give over athletic prowess? Because that's a proxy for military capability. The quarterback and the full forward and the defender and the goalie are all showing coordination and agility and strength that can also go to the battlefield. And endurance, all these things are basically proxies for showing, advertising one's genetic strength and prowess, which can then be great mating signals. Hey, look, I'm a good catch. I'm a good shit, if you will. So these are all things that are underlying in our psychology and our biology. Now we're going to come to a midrash in Kohelet Rabbah right now. So that's a bit of Ev Psych on violence. So we've got, just as we have that clash between our chesed and our gevurah, very hard to choose the right midah, we also have that clash in our software of, on the one hand, cooperation, on the other hand, violence. I'm just thinking of, what was that one? What was that Sacha Baron Cohen session that he did? This is America. Oh, funny. Anyway, so violence is always tragic. I want to talk about here a bit. We're going to go a bit into the big five. This video is going to be long, but we're going to just try and touch on everything. So this is a great drawing of a normal distribution. And we're talking here of the attribute of agreeability and disagreeability. All right? So agreeable people tend to share and be very fair and nice, whereas disagreeable people tend to be a bit less sharing and a bit sterner, a bit harsher. So imagine what would be the ideal disagreeable person. You want them as your lawyer, arguing your case in court or bargaining for you in a negotiation. What's the ideal agreeable person? Imagine a tender, kind-hearted kindergarten teacher or nurse. And of course, we've got capacity to swing between both extremes of chesed and gevurah. But all in all, your personality on that big five attribute is gonna land probably somewhere here in this normal range, right? So imagine here on the right being a bit more, just for the sake of argument, a bit more disagreeable, a bit harsher, and on the left a bit more agreeable. So the more disagreeable you are, the harsher you are. So we've got normal range. This probably encapsulates, getting me back to year 12 maths. About 80% of the population, maybe more, 90%. I'm going to find somewhere here normal. So this person who's a bit more disagreeable over here, he might be a bit intolerable, but He's normal, he's not dangerous. I've written here, beware of psychopathy. Beware of the dangerous people who are right here at the tail ends of this distribution. This is like the 2-3% of people who are complete nutcases. These are your career criminals, these are your hitmen, and these are your people who love violence. I don't really think anybody really truly loves violence. I think people, again, if they've got a bit of empathy and that normal software running through of cooperation and mirror neurons, and enough normal kind of agreeable, disagreeable, nobody likes it. And that's why I think it takes a toll on our psyche when we are forced to do it, when we're forced to witness it, and when we are forced to unleash it, and we are forced to cultivate it in ourselves. And this is one of the tragic costs, if you will, of serving in the military. And I know because I did it myself and I had to come to terms with it. I think we really need to be aware. I know that there's 2 to 3% here. We're going to go a bit off the tangent. I think this is a theory I've been thinking about recently. I think our genes, on average, normal circumstances, the biology aspect of our personality is really going to land us here in this normal range, right, of the normal distribution, not in these tail ends. What gets people out here? Trauma. I think if you look at the really dangerous serial killers, the career criminals like Chopper Reed, who did terrible things you can read about in his books and see in the movie, with Eric Banner in it, that's like childhood trauma, which then evolves, to use the IFS terminology, and my integrative psychology terminology, some survival mechanisms from serious survival situations, traumas, of this extreme harshness, this extreme disagreeability, which then turns into psychopathy, sociopathy. And then that leads to this rageful parts, which then are unleashed on society and everybody else. And then ultimately creates psycho killers. And look, it's a very scary thing. And it's out there. And it's not pleasant to come across. And equally unpleasant is coming within oneself. That own kind of clash, if you will, of going, wow, I've had to kind of delve into a bit of the dark elements of my humanity. There's a great scene I wrote here, Deadwood. Deadwood was a great series, I think from HBO. I watched that 10 years ago. But there's a scene in Deadwood where the heavy of Al Swearingen, by the name of Dan, is this big guy. He gets into this vicious hand-to-hand combat with another heavy of the other big guy, the other tough guy in town. And Dan wins and actually murders the guy viciously in broad daylight. This is the Wild West. And then Dan, in this brilliant scene, you see the psychological toll that takes on Dan. So it shows that Dan, although he was this rough hitman, he still had that empathic component, and it took a toll. Unleashing that deadly violence on that person in a brutal fashion really took a toll, and it took a time for him to process it. Now, this is the challenge of what is from the Midrash of Kehelet Rabbah, where, and I'm going to bring in this IFS, where we are told in that Midrash and warned, and it's linked to this verse, about the necessity of violence, and especially violence against terrible people, evildoers, Hamas, Hezbollah, Nazis, you name it, ISIS, etc. That all who are merciful to the cruel will one day surely be cruel to the merciful. So the misplaced chesed, the misplaced healing and building to people who would kill and destroy you, this ultimately is cruelty to those who you're supposed to protect. And so what flows from that is that it's necessary to be cruel to the cruel. And that is ultimately merciful to the merciful. But again, coming back to our evolutionary psychology and the clash within, we are displacing our own inner chesed, our own kind parts, and embracing our darker gvura, severe, harsh parts. And that's a very difficult process. And through me, only in the past recent years have I started thinking about this and reflecting on it and going, wow, there's some things that I was forced to do, say, observe, and carry out that on normal day-to-day interaction I would never dream of doing outside of the role and the area I was in and the situations I was put in. And part of the toll was that I psychologically suspended all feeling. To paraphrase what Steve Biddulph, who's an Australian psychologist, would say, I got stuck in not feeling. I completely, as it were, to use IFS terminology, exiled that emotional, caring part of myself and put that away and had this mission focus. And that's necessary. I was being cruel to cruel people. Not to use cruel in an absolute term and to say I did anything unprofessional or violation of Geneva Conventions and codes of conduct and ethics. But, to point guns at people, to arrest people, to unleash violence on people, these aren't pleasant things. And again, only psychopaths in the 2-3% of the population relish this. The overwhelming majority of people do not enjoy this process. And that's your humanity speaking there, rather than trauma. Again, just to reiterate, I think it's trauma that puts people at the tail ends of bell curves. So, that's a difficult thing to explore, and it's something that I think through IFS, internal family systems, that people who are returning from service, men and women who've served and been forced to come to terms and unleash violence on other people, witness violence and have violence unleashed on them, can talk to the parts within them and understand, yes, there was perhaps some parts that you had to exile, and maybe some other parts of you don't feel so comfortable with that, and don't feel so happy with that. And you need to embrace the compassion on yourself to understand why you did that and why that was necessary. And here, I think God in Devarim, in the Torah, Deuteronomy, chapter 13, pasuk 18, verse 18, says some great comforting words to those who are going out to war. In another case of milchemet mitzvah, of biblically ordained war, where he says, "V'natan lecha rachamim," I will give you mercy to those who had to go out of the war, "V'rachamcha," and I will put mercy upon you, double it mercy. And part of that, I believe that double mercy is, I'm going to give you mercy. God's going to give you mercy, and God's going to give you, that person who's returning from having to unleash violence, the capacity, "V'rachamcha," to give mercy to yourself through self-reflection and self-forgiveness and self-compassion, to look at, yes, there was that part of you that you had to temporarily suspend, to temporarily put aside, to come to terms with your capacity to break and your capacity to kill and your capacity to unleash harm on others. That was necessary. And now it's time to be merciful to that part and the rest of the parts of you. So that's just something that I think, it's very appropriate with the Parsha and appropriate with the times as more and more understanding of mental health is evolving, and especially the role of mental health for servicemen and women as they return from their service and as they return from the battlefield, coming to terms with those difficult emotions and difficult actions that they've had to deal with, dealing with what has kept us alive, but has also taken a toll. So that's just some food for thought. Covered a lot here. If you have any questions, please put them down below. Feedback and welcome. I understand this is long. You've been with me for almost half an hour, but I hope you're listening to it at 1.5 or double the speed, so it doesn't take that long. So that's it. Be merciful, kind to yourself, but understand that sometimes we need to be harsh to those who would do us harm. Yalla, take care, and shalom, goodbye.